very much. If you don't mind, I'll speak in English. And I'd like to thank Alexander for the organisation of all of this. Here we go. Okay. Okay, I think. Where are we going?
This is switched on.
My apologies. Okay, you all know this. Napoleon's armies were master innovators in all sorts of ways, and one of those was logistics. Nevertheless, the further they went into Russia, they went further into Russia than planned. They stayed longer than expected, and this resulted in catastrophe. The vast distances and poor roads in Russia made transport an insurmountable problem. Some of the troops in charge of Napoleon's supply lines deserted, and others were forced to eat the supplies they were there to guard. The Cossacks raided supply depots, troops, and transport. If retreating soldiers found any food, supplies left, they were rapidly consumed before the bulk of the Grand Army arrived. The scorched earth policy made the supply situation even more precarious. Napoleon's army could not live off the land, it could not rely on its supply chains, it was famously a humiliating disaster. Armies, by their nature, have always been masters of logistics. They know a massive army is pointless if the men are starving or ill due to poor water. Having the finest artillery means nothing if it can't be maintained and munitions brought to deliver them. And in a sense, this is a way of conceiving of particularly our problem as a society, or our condition. In one way, the operations of our societies are everywhere behind enemy lines. Why so? That's because the things we rely upon, the food in the supermarkets, clean water, transport, communications, light, and the functioning of the economy, depends upon global connectivity. And as this has grown increasingly complex, increasingly high speed, the very functioning of the most basic things we have depends on vast, delocalized infrastructures that we barely understand, and mostly we barely notice. Here you'll see a picture of global population and per capita GDP. And you'll see we live in a remarkable moment. There has never been a moment like this. And along with that growth in population and GDP is a growth in complexity of societal organisation, and in a sense we now are part of a global organism. And we depend upon it in its totality. So if there is a global, if we consider it as a global body, the heart cannot declare independence from the lungs. We are intimately connected. Now, one way to see, that we don't notice this connectivity because mostly it works so well. We live, despite the variety we see around us, within a very, very stable system. And I'm going to give you an example of how you can see this. And it's kind of drawn from the discussions of an ongoing slow shock, Brexit. But that will be the last time I mention that word. Consider a BMW factory in Oxford. See the red there? They make 1,000 minis a day. Each one contains over 4,000 parts. 60% come through the port of Dover. These parts arrive in precise sequence and are delivered directly onto the production line in a just-in-time manner. One can make a simple estimate that each of those parts comes from a factory which has an average of 400 inputs. So we're assuming they're less complex. You can see it there, 4,000 inputs, each one of those has 400 inputs. And let's go one step further, a further 400 inputs. So we're going 3 steps along the BMW Mini supply chain. How many connections do you think there are in those 3 steps? Any guess? There's 640 million. Now, that's barely the start, because those work, all of those factories across the world work within, with employees, with critical infrastructures, with supplies of water, with transportations in the area that they're in, with food security so that employees are fed and etc., etc. It needs all transport, communications, it needs financial systems. In other words, even this, with all of that connectivity, rests on other systems, and in that sort of way we see a globalized world. Now, you may have noticed something if you're interested in supply chain risk. If there are, we used our example of millions of connections, there are therefore millions of points where a hurricane, flooding, a civil war, or something could interrupt some of those breaks. And here's the thing, these systems fail on their weakest link. In other words, if you are a mini company and you need 4,000 inputs, you need them all, or most of them, surely. You can't send out a mini without a steering wheel or without a carburetor. Okay, so small shocks somewhere globally in the connectivity can have massive consequences, non-linear consequences. And the question then might be, if as everything got more complex and there's many more points through which interruptions can cascade across the globe, stopping production here or there, why aren't these permanently in a state of crisis? So you make more and more routes to take down that potentially can be interrupted, and yet it keeps growing and we live in a very stable system. Now we notice change as a species, but the background of the day-to-day money works, food in the shops, we take for granted. So, there we go. If we start, here we go. Very good. Okay, so we can see this connectivity. We live in a very stable system that has potentially many routes that are non-linear. We can see this in many different things, but mostly what we've got used to is stability. But increasingly, we're finding that there's an inherent vulnerability in all of this. There are a range of domain experts saying that we are increasingly exposed to catastrophic systems failure if the right part of this global system is compromised. For example, there are growing concerns about the vulnerability of our societies to prolonged grid failure, be it from a solar flare or a state-level hacking, hybrid attack on critical infrastructure. The US President's National Infrastructure Advisory Council's report last year said existing national plans, response, resources, coordination strategies would be outmatched by a catastrophic power outage. Indeed, we are now so interdependent that mutually assured destruction, the MAD of the Cold War era, could become a potential outcome of a state-directed attack if it's large enough on a grid somewhere else. Because of that interdependency, shock spreads through financial systems, supply chains, etc., etc. The likelihood of a severe pandemic is growing. If a pandemic, like the one that happened 100 years ago, the Spanish flu, were to happen today, the impacts, if it had that lethality and spread, would be much worse, because it would start to take down infrastructures, financial systems, and again this non-linear contagion, and you would effectively have a multi-dimensional crisis for the provision of water, food, and everything else. Indeed, 10 years ago, when people talked about saving the global financial system, the ultimate endpoint of things going really wrong would have been all over the place. You can't enact trade. The trade then would cause contagion through trade networks, which would stop you stabilizing the financial system. So you get a cycle. And if the financial system or a pandemic were to happen of enough scale today, you would, if you weren't really well prepared and had done your homework, you would probably get famine in Europe, for example. Large-scale power outages, severe pandemics, global financial systems collapse, war and compounding of threats are among the hazards that could induce large-scale systemic failure. And the complexity of the speed of our societies, it means that such a catastrophe could appear very quickly. But it's only half the story, this vulnerability. In addition to the inherent structural vulnerabilities, there are growing, both in number and intensity, of global stressors. This reflects that we have entered a period where there's growing potential for food, oil and water constraints and disruptions, in addition to the rising impacts from climate change and the feedback from the multidimensional effects our species are having on the wider environment. Within our human system, the potential for severe financial economic crisis grows as indebtedness continues to escalate, while tensions within and between nations also grows. Any one of these things is critical for the maintenance and stability of this global system, and we're seeing threats on all sides. In broad terms, such stresses act to constrain economic growth, causing more and more shocks and volatility, and it starts to push us out of the range of stability that our system evolved in. So you can imagine, again, let's use a body analogy. If you're already sick with something and you get a flu or something else on top of it, it can tip you over. In other words, the impact of, or you never quite recover. So you have this idea of more shocks, more intensifying stresses, repeated shocks, bigger shocks, because these stressors interact through complex global networks, lots of scope for surprise. Okay, so, and one of the things, and this is why we need an integrated view, why there's so much problems with how we look at climate change impacts over there and debt crises over there. In the face of an increasingly integrated world, we need to have an integrated perspective. And what that happens, you realise, is we're very vulnerable to shock transmission for the very reason we mentioned at the beginning. Because you just need breaks in certain places and you can start having non-linear contagion across the globe, so more and more environmental and other crises can start to induce large-scale contagion, breakdown, etc. And here is it in a small little overview: growing vulnerability, increasing range of stressors, they interact, and you can enter a period which we may have entered already of growing destabilization, which may mitigate and even stop you from building certain types of resilience or from adapting. And you can also get large-scale failure on ranges from cities, which might be recoverable, to large-scale global systems failure. So in conclusion, I'm just going to put up sort of 4 little takeaways. One is just about the risk. We need an integrated view of risk that includes vulnerable systems as well as stressors. We are intrinsically vulnerable as we are, and the risks will grow as those stressors interact. Because we're so connected, it means that really the old idea of something like war elsewhere, which becomes more likely, terrorism, war, in these sort of environments, which with a much greater attack surface. Attack surface is just all those places where you can hit one thing which causes a cascade. Obviously people know about, sort of say, attacking the financial system, infrastructure, or whatever, but in the broad sense there are many, many paths to do it. So you have a growing attack surface. You're more likely to have state conflict and terrorism because of constrained economies, broken expectations, fighting over borders, etc. in these sort of contexts. So we're entering a much more dangerous world militarily, and that is as true. But here's the thing, and this is the final word about preparedness. Because societies are interdependent, whether you take out the financial system, or if it fails, or critical infrastructure fails, or there's a pandemic, the outcome is the same. it's a shutdown in the infrastructure of society. No water, no food, things stop flowing. So it's important to prepare for two things. One is, how do we deal with an increasingly volatile and stressed world that starts to overwhelm our historical capacities and how they've developed? It doesn't mean we can't develop new ones. And secondly, how do we deal with large-scale system failure? For the simple reason it is of so high consequence. Not doing it would be really a type of madness. So thank you very much. Thank you, Alexandra, and everyone's support.